Good morning. Welcome to today's Industry Week event, Transform 2020, Resilience in the Age of COVID-19, sponsored by the Council on Competitiveness. My name is Travis Hessman. I'm the Chief Editor of Industry Week, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we dive in today, I just want to explain how everyone out there can participate in the presentation. So first, a critical one, if you're having any audio difficulties or if at some point the slides don't seem to be advancing anymore, your first step is just to hit the F5 key, which will refresh your webcast console. And if you have any other technical difficulties during the session, just press the help button. That will give you some assistance. And please note this webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon or by dragging the lower right corner to enlarge the window so you can shape it as you please. And we do welcome all of your questions during today's event. To submit your questions to today's panelists, just type them into the Q&A window on the left side of your screen and then hit the submit button. We'll be entering as many of these as we can during the Q&A session that'll follow the main presentation. So please feel free to send them in as they occur to you throughout, and we'll add them to the queue. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Industry Week website within the next week for you to review, and we'll notify you by email once that archive is available. Finally, on your console, you notice that the Council on Competitiveness logo is hot linked. So if you'd like to visit their website during the webcast, you can just click on that logo and a new window will open. It will not take you out of the webinar, so you can continue to listen and learn while you browse. All right, and with that, I'm going to welcome today's panelists. We have just an outstanding lineup for you today. Joining us today is the Honorable Deborah Wince-Smith. She's the President and CEO of the Council of Competitiveness. With Mr. Chad Holliday, Chairman, Royal Dutch Shell, National Commissioner and Chairman Emeritus, Council on Competitiveness. Ms. Janet Foutty, she's chair of the board at Deloitte. She's also the National Commissioner and Executive Committee member for the Council on Competitiveness. We have Dr. Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, co-chair, National Commission and University Vice Chair of the Council on Competitiveness. And finally, Dr. Thomas Zacharia, he's the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the co-chair of National Commission, the Council on Competitiveness. Bios for each of these panelists are available in the speaker tab on your console. So if you'd like to learn more about them, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, right now, I'm going to turn things over to Deborah Smith. She's going to provide some context for and outline our objectives for today's session before we dive fully into the discussion. So Deborah, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Travis. The Council on Competitiveness is absolutely delighted to be partnering with you and Industry Week for this very important discussion on resiliency as a core driver of competitiveness. And allow me to thank also our very distinguished panelists, members of the Council on Competitiveness. It was really a dream team to discuss this critical issue. Resiliency and how organizations and governments respond to and recover from disruptions of any kind isn't new, but the global pandemic has brought it front and center. In 2007, the Council released the groundbreaking report, Transform, that made the case that resiliency should be a competitive advantage enabling businesses, higher education, and the public sector to recover from crises more quickly. As then Council Chairman Chad Holliday led that effort, with the president of Carnegie Mellon University, the actual concept of resiliency and enterprise resiliency was quite new. Even then, there was a recognition that globalization, technological complexity, interdependency, terrorism, climate and energy volatility, and yes, the potential for a pandemic were increasing the level of risk that all societies, organizations, and countries face. We posited that the ability to manage these emerging risks, anticipate the interactions between different types of risk, and recover from disruption would be a competitive differentiator for companies, institutions, countries alike. And that was our conclusion 13 years ago. Yet here we are, halfway through 2020, with more than 200,000 Americans dead from the COVID-19 pandemic, at least 13 million Americans unemployed, critical disruptions of our supply chains for medical devices and pharmaceuticals that showed a great weakness in national security products and services that our health depends on. And many colleges and universities continue to struggle to reopen. Americans' lives, everyday lives are disrupted, and many small and medium businesses have closed their doors. So it is a fair question to ask, why weren't we as a nation more resilient, more prepared, more able to respond with built-in resiliency? Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has shaken the global economy, and that may well have been unexpected, but it was not unanticipated. Yet many policymakers and other stakeholders continue to treat the pandemic as an out-of-the-blue occurrence that could not have been planned for and that will require at least 12 to 18 months from which to recover. And that is not resiliency. To underscore that resiliency must be standard operating procedure for the public and private sectors by now, the Council Board asked the Council leadership to update and release Transform 2020, which we are doing today in partnership with Industry Week. The report contains insights and recommendations from the original report. And let me just share, however, two of the major insights in 2020 Transform to jumpstart our conversation with this distinguished panel. First, policymakers at all levels of activity across our nation, federal, state, local, must acknowledge that a national objective must be more than homeland protection. It also must include economic and social resilience, the ability to mitigate and recover quickly from disruption. There are an infinite number of disruption scenarios, but only a finite number of outcomes. As a result, leading organizations do not manage for specific scenarios. Rather, they create the agility and flexibility to cope with turbulent situations and recover therefrom. Similarly, businesses must make the case for investment in resilient strategies to manage the spectrum of risks, not just catastrophic ones. Making a business case for investment in defenses against low probability events, even those with high impact, is of course difficult. However, making the business case for investments that assure business continuity and shareholder value must be a priority at the highest levels of corporate governance. Our outstanding panel will address these issues and offer their insights and recommendations to build resiliency into the very fabric of all business strategy and operations. So I encourage all of our listeners today to take a look at Report Transform 2020 and share the important message it contains, and also in your respective organizations, begin to build resiliency into the fabric of your life. So back to you, Travis, to get our panel started, and thank you again for moderating our discussion today.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much. And I think you set the context there brilliantly. And from the Industry Week perspective, we're totally in line there. Resiliency, as we see it, is this critical part of the manufacturing business operations, continuous improvement. This is why flexibility is such an important metric of the best performing companies right now. And this has been the most frustrating part over the last 6 months. We've watched manufacturers across the industry perform what I describe as like absolutely heroic acts of innovation. They're scrambling ahead with limited resources, short planning cycles. They're reworking supply chains, transforming operations, shifting markets entirely to produce and deliver goods, to fill their critical supply shortages and keep their people safe, which is perhaps above all. And it's been this, as I said, this brilliant display of innovative genius all the way through. But the frustrating part is that it's had to be such a scramble, which I think is what you outlined in the report. It's like what we're learning now about resiliency. We learned after September 11th, we learned after Fukushima, we learned through the Great Recession and every major crisis before it. And After so much practice with these kinds of crises, my hope was that businesses had procedures and plans to deal with these kinds of crises. But what we've learned from this year, as you outlined, Deborah, it's generally not the case, which is a frustrating reality of the world. So for the next 45 minutes or so, our plan is we're going to engage this amazing panel of experts to help understand where resiliency planning fell short through this crisis, what the future is going to look like for all of their various industries, and what businesses need to do today to shore up resiliency plans to take on the crises that are yet to come. And as we dive into this now, for the panelists, I'm going to begin by throwing questions out to individual panelists. However, I would really love to get some conversation going on these topics as well. So if we touch on topics that that cross over into your industry, please feel free to chime in, and we can get this conversation going. All right, and that's enough for context. I think we're going to dive in here. And Mr. Holliday, I'm going to throw the first question to you. I think just because you're in a very interesting position here. The chemical industry, along with the financial industry and the energy industries, is just highly sensitive to change, and it really needs resilience in the face of threats, whether man-made or forces of nature. We need these industries to continue with minimal disruption. So, from your perspective at Shell, I was wondering if you could tell us how a focus on resilience has evolved in these sectors.
Oh, Travis, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting us. This is a great cooperation. Let me answer your question by going back to the original study just a bit, because I think I'm the one member that was a part of that. And we started out in 2006, 2007. Our objective wasn't to conclude resilience was the issue. Our objective was to figure out what the country needed to do about the next major risk. And one of the things we did is try to identify what that could be. And we went to business leaders, we went to insurance executives who focus on risk a lot, and we looked at hometown security, right down to grassroots level. And all three groups came up with their top 10 risks. So no one anticipated the financial crisis, which was going to start the next year after our report. So it goes to show you something that had tremendous impact to the country was just off our radar screen. And looking back at those lists, only one group, the insurance executives, identified a pandemic, and that was number 9 on their list. So although in our report we talked about the possibility of that, it clearly was not seen as what we experienced today. So we concluded you can't guess the next risk. What you can do is focus on resiliency that will serve overall. I think from my experience at Shell and other places, there are 3 fundamentals that underlie how you build resiliency. The first one is your employees know why they are doing things, not just what to do. Because in crisis time, you won't be able to follow that exact procedure. But if you know why you're doing it, you can adopt to the new procedures. And we've seen that extensively in Shell as we were operating an offshore platform. We have to do it differently now, and we know why, not just what the procedure was, because our procedures have changed drastically as a result of COVID-19. The second one, and it's probably the most important, is you get really clear about your core values that you just will not compromise as you deal with this new challenge, be it respect for people, safety, environment, ethics. You spend a lot of time talking about those because you know they will be challenged during this period of time. And you have to be sure that the whole team at the working level and at the most senior level in the company are really clear about what those need to be. And third, which you need to have done in advance, and I believe in Shell we have done this quite well in advance, is think about what could happen and anticipate what you could do in that situation if you didn't have all the resources you're used to. Now, for example, we routinely, every hurricane season, in our offshore platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, anticipate how bad a storm we have to have. When do we have to evacuate? When do we just need to take other precautions? That is something we are really good at. So what we're having to do is take things that we're not as good at, because we didn't have that for COVID-19. So we're having to put those things in place. I think a very simple example would be a hospital should have thought through which things can I continue to do without an IT system, and which things are going to redeploy patients to another facility. So it's important for every organization to have thought through those. I think we have before this one, but not as much as I'm sure we will do in the future. I hope that's useful to you to get started.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And so we're talking about how it's evolved, and what you're describing here is like you need a process in place that helps you cope with these. You don't know what the crisis is going to be, but you have a process in place for crisis management, for resiliency. Is a good way to summarize that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also being sure you're listening to your people throughout the entire thing. They're on the ground. What we found in Shell, in COVID-19, for example, China was hit first. And so we learned how our different operations in China, including a big retail operation, how do we operate very differently there? And then as the pandemic hit other countries, we had learned from China, but because the culture was different, we couldn't do it exactly like China. But it was interesting tracing the pandemic around the world. We would learn from every previous case, and it circled all the way back around. So as China had another flare-up, they learned from all the other countries. So I think techniques like that are very important.
That's good. And I guess the follow-up for that is like we have 13 years from the original report, many crises in between there, a lot of opportunity to learn and to develop these processes, and a lot of, I guess, real-world examples of why these processes are so important. And I just wonder, from your perspective, why do you think it seems that we weren't prepared as we should have been for this current crisis?
Well, a great question, Travis. After SARS, I was actually working with DuPont at the time, and we could clearly see there was going to be another pandemic. And we could see personal protective equipment was going to be needed. And we even at the time, built up a stockpile of personal protective equipment. And in some cases, we issued it to individual locations. And we encourage other companies to do the same thing. Now, we made some of that personal protective equipment, so it was a business too. I don't want to underestimate that. But what I think is, with time and the crisis doesn't happen, you lose your staying power. So what I think, those backlogs of personal protective equipment slowly got taken down over time, because we somehow thought it wouldn't really happen again. So having, if you'll excuse the term, muscle memory from what's happened in the past, and not lose your staying power, because this is a great example of that.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to jump over now to Ms. Foutty for a question there. And this touches on a lot of what Mr. Holliday was discussing there in terms of the workforce and how to handle the people issue in terms of resiliency. This is I guess the general statement here is that workforce flexibility and redeployment of people and expertise to respond and recover quickly is a vital component for everything that we're discussing here. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you could expand on this idea a little bit in light of the current pandemic and its impact across multiple sectors of our economy.
Excellent, of course, Travis, and you can hear me well?
I can.
My mic was missing a little bit. Excellent. So first of all, appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And this is a topic that in leading a professional services firm, as well as helping our clients navigate this landscape, is something I and we are spending a lot of time on. I would also say, absolutely building on Chad's answer, I think 2 of the 3 essential things he talked about in terms of making sure that your teams understand the why, as well as the focus on values, are so critical and will certainly thread through some of the things I'm going to talk about. So if I take us back to the onset of the pandemic, all of us, business leaders, government leaders, academics, were challenged to respond both quickly and rethink their workforce strategies in real time, to the point that we might not have been as in front of it as we should have been. And it was really about 4 things. It was about health, it was about safety, it was about essential services, and the virtualization of work and education. So if you think about those, as we navigate the recovery phase, which we just did a survey globally, and about 3/4 of organizations would still say they're in recovery phase. I and we believe that resilient leaders should not just be thinking about how to get back to the old ways of doing business, but instead recognize the imperative and opportunity in this crisis created to really re-engage our workforces and reinvent our workplaces. So akin to the conversation we were just having, this is something we've been talking about for a really long time, the future of work. Maybe not as far back as the SARS crisis, but the future of work has been sort of front and center in the conversation for the last handful of years. And I do believe some of the goodness of this terrible situation we find ourselves in is there is a real imperative around the future of work. So that being said, long-term change can certainly be unsettling to many workers, balancing the really divergent expectations remaining at home versus return to the workplace. The implications of mental health and productivity are all so critical to establishing trust. And I believe that how organizations handle recovery has really long-term implications around brand, with not only your workforce, but your customers, clients, and suppliers, your organization's reputation, and frankly, future competitiveness to the topic more broadly. I've been thinking about the recovery process as really a bridge between the crisis response and how we well lay the foundation for the future around workforce. And as we were thinking about the bridge, we developed a framework. Of course, professional services consultants, we sort of live and breathe in frameworks in thinking about how do we process workforce-related strategies. So we've been really focused on 5 things: reflect, recommit, re-engage, rethink, and reboot. So if you'd humor me, I just want to tick through those briefly and why they matter and what they mean to me. We could spend all hour, I think all of us, riffing on these. So reflect, which very much is a comment, sort of ties into Chad's commentary, is taking the time and space now to reflect on what's worked, what's been learned, and what was missed in the initial response phase, in that scramble you were so eloquently talking about. And how you create the time and space for management. And Chad and I, as having the privilege to lead boards, I'm sure he shares my experience, but we've been putting a lot of pressure on our management team to take the time and the space to reflect. And that is so important around workforce. The second is recommit to workforce well-being and purpose, the purpose word again, through a focus on both physical, psychological, and financial concerns. Physical well-being focused on health and safety. I'm sure you'll hear from my academic colleagues on the phone the incredible work they've been doing around health and safety. And psychological, which is certainly includes but is not limited to the diversity of worker expectations, which I certainly have in my own team, as well as supporting them through to recovery. So re-engaging, an incredible opportunity for leaders to provide teams, managers, and workers with clear directions on change in work priorities and routines, again, rooted in that clarity of the why, including new technologies and digital ways of working. I think this is so critical for re-engaging and redeploying where necessary the workforce, and how organizations prepare and support their workforces for the new routines, priorities, roles, and assignments, I believe will be a key driver of workforce performance. So rethinking workforces, workplaces to really accelerate that future of work transformation I was talking about, identifying new business priorities, highlighting where returning to work earlier priorities is appropriate and where we really need new work, which is all about context and direction for the rationale behind the new priorities, having those conversations about the new workplace realities among on-site and online work. The fairness of workforce policies is something we've been talking a lot about. And this rethinking really involves a shift in perspective, challenging leaders to be very bold in the face of uncertainty. And then the last reboot, which is very specific to HR and HR priorities, and maybe not something we talk about in these forums very much, but I think the part of the recovery process pertains directly to how you realign the HR function and people operations with the most pressing business and workforce priorities. The recovery may not be as successful if the HR function doesn't embrace sort of a redefined role that can both anticipate and orchestrate the new priorities. And I personally believe that HR leaders are uniquely positioned to prepare, support, and leverage their workforce through both recovery and position the company for a new era of both resiliency and sustainability, which is really what it's all about. So those are the things I've been thinking about and helping our clients think through as we focus on, I believe, the incredibly important dialogue in and around the talent experience and workforce resiliency, both now and again, to underscore Chad's point, the not just sort of living through the crisis, but resetting for a much more effective workforce and much more agile workforce as we go forward.
That's excellent. And I think that's great. Because like I noticed before this panel went live, everyone got together and we had the same discussion that I think everybody has at the beginning of every virtual meeting. It's comparing our work setting, comparing our strategies and our situations, and finding out what's effective. And I think that's what I'm looking forward to most at the end of this, is where we can evaluate what we've gone through, create a plan for the future, and then take a fresh look at our workforce strategies to see what we really need and what is the best way forward. Because we're kind of at the 6 months break from tradition, most of us, and so it's a whole new paradigm for working in a work life. So this is going to be an interesting period.
And I guess I would just underscore that I don't believe that, I think the discussion is so important now because I believe there's so much we've already learned, and because it does not appear in some of our settings that we will be fundamentally shifting everyone back in the offices the way we were just over 6 months ago. That really being thoughtful in and around how we think about talent now is so critical. So I would just underscore that point.
It's really interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. So we're going to jump here to a couple of questions for Dr. Crow. And I think this one, more than any, I think over the last couple of weeks, this has been really spotlighted in the national media attention, which is resiliency in the universities. And how different colleges, different universities, different systems are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been a tremendous test for this very unique institution. So Dr. Crow, I was wondering from your perspective at Arizona State University, and looking at everything that you've been working through over the last 6 months, in particular the last couple of weeks, do you think at this point that higher education is going to come out of this crisis stronger than it entered?
Well, I mean, Travis, I think that sector will certainly reconsider its archaic mindset, its Stone Age logic, its basically ancient 1,000-year-old way of considering things, the way that it tells time, like Stonehenge. And so the reason for this verbiage and this terminology is that our sector is a sector with this dual responsibilities. So one responsibility that we have is the preparation of the next generation as the most enabled learners that humans have produced. That's part of what our assignment is. And then secondly, we have to figure out how to do all of that while surrounded by whatever we encounter along the way, socially, culturally, economically, what have you. And so what I'm hopeful of is that out of this, that some colleges and universities will begin to realize, the poor job that we've done of preparing our society and our population for these kinds of things. And so let me just make 5 quick points. One thing that we've done in all sectors, including universities, is that we've forgotten as a species where we live. We live on an unbelievably challenging, unbelievably complicated planet, which has been involved in transformative species evolution for billions of years, and we are a part of all of that. We deny it, we deny it, we deny it. We haven't successfully yet ingrained into the mind of humans that it is our job to figure out how to be resilient and our job to figure out how to be adaptive. And so one of the things I hope that colleges and universities do going forward is make this a central part of their logic. Second, the planet that we live on, Mother Earth, is not always a sweet mother. She's a very disciplinary mother. She basically produces 3 coronaviruses in the last 20 years, 2 of which, SARS and MERS, were highly lethal and not very contagious, and this one, which is less lethal and highly contagious. And we're not much better prepared than we were 20 years ago to deal with these things, meaning we haven't figured out yet how to make and inculcate into our basic design of our learning process this notion of resilience and adaptability at the level that we need to. We used to in indigenous peoples and in ancient times. We don't as much as we did in the past. So we need new cultural structures for the colleges and universities. We need new technological empowerment for the colleges and universities. We also have to start thinking about something else within the colleges and universities, which is this conflict between individual liberty and group liberty. This notion that somehow every individual gets to make their own decision, and then that will somehow then result in a positive outcome when you have things that then involve everyone, like pandemics or global climate change or adaptation or what have you. We need to continue to evolve our philosophies. Not every great philosophy is from someone from 400 years ago or 2,000 years ago. How about now? How about new concepts, new ideas, and new premises? And I think that more practical side of things, the colleges and universities need what I call a post-Stone Age design, intellectually vigorous, intellectually creative, intellectually engaged, but moving in real time. So one of the things that the pandemic shows us is that all things are now accelerated to at least triple time or quadruple time anything that we've experienced in the past. And institutions like colleges and universities are slow in that regard, and they need to become less slow and more resilient in that regard. And so all of these things being brought forth together then give us a huge opportunity to take this lesson of the pandemic, which is a small net effect compared to some of the things that lie ahead of it, and rethink the structures of our colleges and universities overall so that they can not only help us to move through these kinds of events like the pandemic, but also help us to alter the way that we see our relationship with the natural systems in which we're embedded. Because right now we live in a big denial. We deny that we are a biological organism. We deny that we are influenced and affected by all of these systems. We live as if somehow we're above it all, when in fact we're not. We're just in the midst of it. So here's one last sort of image to give you. So you have more individual microorganisms of other species living on and in your body than you do cells of your own species, of your own human creation. We have no idea even what any of that means. We are still somewhere slightly less ignorant than a true stone about how the world actually works. We need to become less ignorant, more resilient, more adaptive, and more in line with the way that this place really works, something that we've been denying. So, Travis, that's one of the main things that universities need to do.
That's excellent. And so, I mean, that echoes what we were just talking about with Foutty. Is like, this is like turning this negative disruption into a positive disruption, giving an opportunity to rethink the structures and rebuild them, since they've the normal way of doing things has been broken out of our control. We have control in how we reassemble it. And so in that sense, you're arguing that higher education is going to come back stronger and healthier if we do that due diligence and really doing the work of recalculation as we come into this, right?
Yes, and so not everyone makes those kinds of transitions, but so for instance, one thing that college universities should be doing is, again, not pretending that no one else exists. There should be leagues of colleges and universities working together, sharing resources, sharing assets, adapting together, working together in new ways. And so I think all of those things are possible. We should also find a way to educate people. We still have people that, believe that, you fight a virus by basically yelling. Well, there's no way to fight a virus through a voice. You have to fight a virus through, actually an intellectual response. We need to get to the point where we can have those intellectual responses immediately. And that then means we have to find better ways to teach and better ways to learn. So colleges and universities have to do that all.
Oh, excellent. I guess just one more follow-up on that. Is we see different university systems responding very differently there. And for those of us with children or who are ourselves in this system, it's a very frustrating and strange place to be. And so, I guess from your perspective, what do these resiliency plans and processes look like, or what should they look like in this system?
So we've taken the approach that this is the seventh coronavirus added to the human ecosystem. This coronavirus will be here with us forever. It must be managed like all the others, and so we approach this as a management problem. And the management problem is that we have to change how we're operating our system. We have to create new ways for humans to interact. And so right now, there's still large amounts of the educational sector waiting for the virus to go away, waiting for a vaccine to arrive. A vaccine will arrive, and it will be useful for some people. It'll have some utility while this virus then morphs and changes and genetically alters itself as it interacts with humans. And so the main psychological step that people have to work with here is high-speed, real-time adaptation of institutional designs and institutional structures. We deployed the ability to zoom in and out of every classroom, not just to zoom a faculty member out, but to zoom people in and out of any classroom on one day's notice. We created a saliva-based high-speed robot-driven testing system, which allows us to test virtually everyone. We created a health check app that allows us to check the health status of every person. It's probable that every school in the country will need some forms of these kinds of things going forward. And it's just moving into this notion of adaptation, adapting to this reality going forward, as opposed to necessarily waiting for a single heroic solution. There is no single heroic solution to anything like a virus.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I guess we're going to jump over from here to Dr. Zacharia from Oak Ridge. And this is again a really interesting position that you've found yourself in. Oak Ridge is the largest science and energy laboratory in the Department of Energy Systems, and it's central to many economic and national security priorities across the country. It's an essential component to everything that's going on. And so I guess the question for you with the state of the world and with this crisis, how do you ensure resilience in the face of, I guess, not just this, but a myriad of potential disruptions that could affect you?
Well, thank you, Travis, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I'll just build on what my fellow panelists already talked about. Particularly, Chad talked about making sure that we understand the focus and value of the institution. I would say employees must know why or communicate often. And Janet talked about it as an opportunity to also reflect and reboot. So let me connect all those things in the context of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. As you mentioned, we're one of the oldest national laboratories. We just, we came into being during a time when we were fighting another war, and it was explicitly created to to win the war and change the world. And I think we took the same approach faced with this pandemic, even though as a major national laboratory with lots of critical assets that the nation relies on, we have a plan that we call a number of sort of plans that are put in place that we exercise regularly to make sure that if something happens, we are able to, at a minimum, protect the assets. And then in this particular case, we had to quickly decide at a time when in a mid-March, when many institutions were shutting down, we were faced with the decision as to whether we're going to shut down and then wait to restart later on, or decide that we are going to be part of the national response to this pandemic. And we chose the latter. And so on a weekend, we actually had our entire team come into the laboratory, and we learned a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about what is critical, what needs to stay up, who needs to be at the laboratory, and who can work from home. And essentially over a weekend, we pushed 70% of our staff off-site, while communicating to the other 30% as to why they had to come back on-site again. And I think that communication is important because people need to feel safe. They need to know why they are doing what they're doing. They need to feel safe that they're going to be taken care of. So we operated with the model of, the mission first, people always. We wanted to make sure that the people who were coming to work felt safe, that we were communicating very frequently to the people who were working from home so that they didn't feel disconnected. To me, I think that was essential. And as we look at our experience over the last 6 months, I would say that communication, but also that commitment to the mission was important. Now, you might ask, what are some of the critical missions that we have? At the simplest, the mundane, on the one end, you may not know this, but we as the National Lab keep the fueleconomy.gov website up and running. So it is something that every American goes and checks when they're buying a car. So that's on the mundane side. We had to keep that up and running to, again, provide a sense of normalcy to the community at large. And on the other spectrum, because of our high-flux isotope reactor, which is the most powerful research reactor in the Western Hemisphere, which is critical to the production of a number of isotopes, including actinium-225, which is a therapeutic that is an absolute necessary for say, prostate cancer treatment. So if you're a cancer patient, making sure that the supply chain for this medical isotope is available is critical to the nation. So we kept the major user facilities like the reactor, but also the spallation neutron source, which is necessary to perform research on COVID, as well as supercomputers that were made available to the entire scientific community as part of a national White House initiative, which has been important and critical for a number of analysis in terms of therapeutics, drug design, and so forth. I'll also touch on what Janet mentioned. This was also a time of reflection. This is the first time where a number of us were on site, not traveling much. And so we decided that this was also an important time for us to reflect on where we are, what did we learn from this experience, and also how do we want to position the institution for the next 20 years, building on what we learned from this process. And so we actually went through a reimagining of the laboratory, asking ourselves what are the important scientific and research challenges of the laboratory and a nation would be facing over the next 20 years, and decided to reorganize and restructure the laboratory. And during the 6 months, actually hired 400 people in key scientific and managerial leadership position to achieve that goal. So I think what I would say is that resilience is something that we have to be explicitly be thinking about and reflecting and learning all through the process to make sure that not only are we doing the best job that we can today, but recognizing, as it was pointed out, we'll have other crises that we will face, and want to make sure that the institution remains ready and vigilant for the next such challenge.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I guess as a follow-up, you touched on this a little bit. I wonder if we could get into it a little bit more. And that's the role that the national labs play in ensuring resilience across the local, regional, and the national levels.
Well, I mean, so the national labs have extensive resources in planning for and responding to and preventing disruptions at all these levels, right? So we are called upon to respond for national and international emergencies, which are, as a system, there are 17 national labs, and we were called upon for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, as well as most recently to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Department of Energy, under the auspices of the Office of Science, stood up the National Virtual Biotechnology Laboratory, basically making the resources of the 17 national laboratories available to industry, academia, as well as our own staff in dealing with a number of issues, including, say, for example, N95 filters for masks. I'll just give you an example. Peter Tsai, who's the inventor of the N95 mask, actually turns out to be a retired professor in Knoxville. So we had him come to, and we repurposed our carbon fiber technology facility to actually produce N95 filters and then transfer the technology to industry. We worked with Coca-Cola company. It turns out that the preform that they use for Coke bottles turned out to be a perfect fit for test kits. And so we worked with Coca-Cola, and we connected them to the supply chain so that Longhorn Vaccines and Diagnostics are actually consuming about 1 million such test tubes per week. So we were actually working on making sure that our assets, both our people as well as the unique facilities that all these labs have, are brought to bear on these and other pandemics.
Excellent.
Travis,
right,
could I jump in there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, please do.
Well, I was just reflecting on each of our comments and thinking about Deborah's opening thread around sort of the lack of progress on resilience. And what I take great optimism from is each of our institutions actually figured out with great ability how to keep providing the services that we were providing to the community. I think the thing that I want to continue to push my and our thinking on is how do we do that collaboratively in a very differentiated way, which is obviously a big part of the purpose of the council. Because when I think about the stories of getting hundreds of thousands of students back on campus and keeping a lab up and running, and we moved 105,000 people across US and India to remote work, all within the course of a week. So I do take some optimism around our creativity and resilience individually. I would love to continue to explore how we think about that collectively, sort of for the good of our communities and society, which is very much sort of sat at the heart, I thought, of Dr. Crow's comments. So just reflecting on all these together, I do take some optimism as well as lots of lessons learned.
I think that's excellent. And I think that kind of pushes us to another fundamental question that we can take on as a group. And Foutty, since you were talking, I can throw this to you first off. And I think this is central to us. What is the objective of organizational resilience? If we're going to design processes to hold up all of these different and very unique institutions, what is the objective that we're trying to receive or to see?
Yeah, so I'm, as you can tell from earlier, not good at quick answers because there's so much to say there, but I'm going to try to give you a very pithy response, which is I think it is about how do we end up stronger and ahead of where we were versus not questing or yearning to go back to the past. And I think that you certainly heard from all of us that desire to keep that principle really, really clear, stronger and ahead of where we were before, and not a quest or a temptation to go back to the past. That's what I think about.
I think I would just add and agree with Janet that if you ask the question, what's the objective of organizational resilience? Like all things, we need to understand how things work. These are evolutionary forces, and what we need is enhanced levels of cooperation, which then enhance adaptation, which then enhance the success of broader ecosystems. And right now, what we have is two narrow sets of ecosystems: the private sector going off one way, and this group going off that way, and so forth and so on. And that then doesn't allow us to be as adaptive as we need to be, particularly because as a species, we're a dominant species on the ecosystem of the planet. So then it requires us to now work together in ways that aren't natural for us, and that's done at the organizational level. So I think that Janet's got it exactly right. What we need are whole new ways of coming together, and when we come together, what will happen is each of our organization's goals will become a little bit broader and a little bit modified and a little bit more tied to both resilience and success. And so I think it's the definitive trajectory that I hope we can follow.
Yeah, I think I would also add that, if I may, is that, much like species, if organizations don't adapt, and then we will fail. So the only option is to continue to think about the future, position the organization to come out of it stronger. I also think that one of the things that I'm beginning to recognize is that many of our staff, and I'm sure that all of you find the same as well, is that many people who thought that they could not work from home effectively, where both the organizations and our staff have figured out that they can, which makes them much more mobile. We certainly are not planning for our entire staff to come back, which is changing our plans for infrastructure as to how we're going to deploy infrastructure for the long term. So I think that there's a constant evolution and adaptation that is essential to keep the institution continue to grow and become stronger.
That's excellent. And I had one more question before we turn it over to the general Q&A. Dr. Zacharia, I think this one, we can start with you on this. As we're building these resiliency plans and getting these processes in place, do we only focus primarily on the highest impact risks for this, or do we do kind of like a broad-based resiliency plan to cover the whole bit?
I think that there's a danger if you approach it as looking at one in silos. At least our experience is that we have to have a portfolio approach where you have to think about the risk associated with your vision of where we want to position the laboratory. You have to look at operational risk, workforce management risk, as well as financial risk. And I think that it is really an optimization problem as opposed to just focusing on one part of the organization. I don't think we can get there without taking an overall balanced approach.
All right, excellent. I guess, Mr. Holliday, I wonder if you had a perspective on that question.
Yeah, I think in this particular session you've led for us here, Travis, has been very helpful. Yeah, I found at Shell we've made a lot of new friends during this crisis. We didn't realize we were so close to other organizations, particularly in communities, not necessarily on a corporate level, but we've learned so much at the individual location level, individual city, individual place in the country. But as I sit here and listen to what every one of the colleagues on this panel have said, I wish I'd met them 6 months ago too, with this in mind. We'd have learned so much more, but that wasn't obvious to me. And just to hear how Michael describes managing this issue, well, I wish I'd heard that perspective 6 months ago, because I'm going to take that back to Shell to be sure we're thinking about the fact this coronavirus is going to be with us forever. So I think somehow we have to find those friends we haven't already met, and how do we build a relationship with them and really learn from that? I think we could be so much stronger, which I think is what's behind your question.
All right. Well, excellent. From here, we're running a little bit short on time, but I am going to jump over to a couple of questions from attendees before we hand things back to Deborah to close this up. So we're going to get to, as I said, as many of these questions as we can. And as we do, everyone listening in and watching in out there, I'm just asking you to take a quick minute to complete the feedback form on the left side of your toolbar as we close things up here. In this one, I wanted to rush and get into this, Mr. Holliday, because I think this kind of touches on that sentiment that you just brought up. And the question reads, would you say that resilience strategies will differ for different industries, or are there some common or umbrella approaches to resilience that we can explore? Now, I mentioned you, Mr. Holliday, but anyone could jump in on that.
Yeah, let me go ahead. And look, I think there is I go back to my time at university, and I had a professor that told me that all are the same, the details are just different. At the time, I thought, well, this guy doesn't know the real world. It took me about 10 years later to figure out he was right. So I do think all the problems are the same, but the details do matter. So it's not either or. It's we have to have both. But I think there's so much. I mean, I think I could learn from every organization that's been on this call today, and by your question. So I think we have to have both.
Very good. I think that's going to be an interesting project. Once we get through this enough that we can look back on it, is recording all of the best practices that companies did and really kind of celebrating the successes so we can incorporate that into our resiliency plans. That's going to be a fascinating and ongoing subject, at least from particularly from the industry perspective, but I think across the world. I have one more question I want to throw in here, and I think in part because this fits so well into the discussion with the Council on Competitiveness. How do you think that that private and public organizations should collaborate to increase resilience? I think particularly during this pandemic crisis.
Well, one thing that I would add, Travis, is there's a strong need for people to start realizing that all private organizations and all public organizations have shared common goals and objectives that they must work towards: human capital development objectives, natural capital development objectives, acting and behaving in resilient ways, and so forth. So my hope is that there's a coming together of sectors and overlapping of interests, and more and more understanding and interaction with each other. I just think that what I'm hopeful of is that we can become less sector-bound, less sector-driven, and more outcome-driven, more driven by a set of socially, economically, culturally, and economically transformative sets of goals and objectives. That's my hope from all of this, is that we can see that we have to work together, and we have to work together more than we have in the past.
All right. Well, excellent. I don't know. This is a really fantastic conversation. I think we only scratched the surface on where we need to go, but I certainly learned a lot, and I think our attendees did as well. It really gets us going. Now, to close this off, because we are really close to the top of the hour, I'm going to hand the mic back to Deborah Wince-Smith, who has some closing words for us.
Thank you, Travis. Well, let me just thank our outstanding panelists who really elucidated the core imperative for resiliency, but really as a driver of competitiveness, growth, and transformation. And I thought I just might, in closing, mention that competitiveness is a journey that may have a beginning, but it never has an end. And it's really all about how we come together to produce the capacity for productivity and prosperity for all our people. And if you think of the 3 building blocks going forward to build an inclusive prosperity for our citizens in the United States, but also in our leadership around the world, we have tremendous capacity for innovation that we've all discussed today, agility, adaptation, trying to foresee what was not foreseen in the beginning. Resiliency needs to be built into the fabric of all our operations. Just as in the 1980s, some of us remember the thrust for total quality management. And we learned that in order to be in business, quality needed to be almost the table stakes. Without that, you couldn't succeed. And I think building the resiliency into all operations has a similar imperative. And finally, the ultimate building block is sustainability. Sustainability of individuals living on this planet, of societies, and the ability to adapt and learn and grow from whatever risks will fall us. And I like to think often of the quote of John Paul Jones, our famous naval officer in the Revolutionary War, who says, you know, without accepting and understanding risks, there will never be any rewards. So resiliency is at the heart of competitiveness, of our innovation, and our standard of living and security as a nation. And so I want to thank you very much, Travis and Industry Week, for partnering with us. And I have to say, as president and CEO of the Council on Competitiveness, I'm extremely proud of the fabulous members that participated today, representing industry, academia, and our national labs, who clearly have given us new insights and a new roadmap for building a resilient future. So thank you so much. And please read the report, Transform 2020.
In here, if you'd like to to access that report, you just go to compete.org/reports. You can get Transform 2020, Resilience in the Age of COVID-19. It's a good way to close this off. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everyone involved in this. The Honorable Deborah Wince-Smith, Mr. Chad Holliday, Ms. Janet Foutty, Dr. Michael Crow, Dr. Thomas Zacharia, our sponsor Council on Competitiveness, and of course, everyone out there for tuning in today. And with that, on behalf of Industry Week, I'll just wish everyone out there a productive remainder of your day. Thank you very much.